So, I want you to imagine being a man in your late 50s.
Okay, late 50s, got it.
Yeah, and you're already suffering from these really chronic, just debilitating health issues. You're living in exile. You're struggling to make ends meet. And frankly, you have already written enough revolutionary political theory to ensure your name is going to be remembered for centuries.
Right. I mean, you've essentially secured your legacy at that point.
Yep.
Most people would probably just retire.
Exactly. You take it easy. But instead of resting, you suddenly decide that you need to learn fluent Russian from scratch.
Oh, wow. Russian is not an easy language to just casually pick up in your late 50s.
No, it's really not. And why does he do it? Because the grand sweeping theory of human history that you are trying to finalize, it depends entirely on reading these highly obscure, raw agrarian tax reports from the Russian Empire.
I mean, that is just a level of intellectual obsession that almost borders on masochism, honestly.
It really does.
But I think it perfectly illustrates the reality behind these historical monuments we usually study. Because we tend to look at massive political movements like their, I don't know, pristine architecture.
Like these imposing skyscrapers with clean lines of ideology.
Yeah, exactly. But when you actually look at the primary sources, you find the architect's tear-stained diary hidden inside the desk right next to a Russian dictionary and, like, angry letters complaining about the local post office.
And that is exactly what we were doing today. If you are joining us, you're someone who inherently wants to understand the hidden mechanics of how our world was built. You want to look past the surface.
We're getting to the messy blueprints today.
We really are. We're taking a massive deep dive into a highly pivotal and just incredibly volatile window in history, specifically the years 1874 to 1883.
A hugely consequential decade.
Huge. We are unpacking volume 24 of the Marx and Engels collected works, along with the very personal, very intense letters they were writing to each other and their allies during that exact same decade.
And the stakes here, they really could not be higher. We're looking at a 10-year stretch where global empires were fracturing, industrial capitalism was morphing into something entirely new, and these two men in London were frantically trying to build an international political machine before the whole system just tore itself apart.
Now, before we get into the weeds of how they actually did that, let's lay our cards on the table. The text we're unpacking today contains some highly politically charged material.
Very charged.
We're talking about the foundational arguments regarding capitalism, socialism, class struggle, and the role of the state. So, because of that, I want to be explicitly clear with you about our role here. This deep dive maintains strict neutrality.
Right. We are not taking sides here.
Absolutely not. We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the original text, nor are we here to condemn them. We are acting entirely as impartial guides. Our sole mission today is to help you understand these historical ideas, the underlying logic of their arguments, and the strategies they deployed, exactly as they were written in the source material.
We're just here to decode the blueprints.
Exactly. Decode the blueprints.
And decoding this specific blueprint really requires us to start with the trauma that shaped it. Because everything written in Volume 24, all the theory and all that frantic organizing, it's fundamentally a reaction to the ultimate political hangover of the 19th century.
Which was the 1871 Paris Commune.
Exactly, the Paris Commune.
The hangover that forced a total strategic reset. Let's paint the picture for what actually happened in 1871, because honestly, you cannot understand Marx and Engels in 1874 without understanding the absolute shock of Paris.
Right. So the Paris Commune was essentially this massive, spontaneous uprising. Following the disastrous end of the Franco-Prussian War, the working class and the radicalized National Guard in Paris just essentially took over the city.
The French government basically fled to Versailles. Right.
They did. They fled.
Yeah.
And for a brief, really radical period of a little over 2 months, the workers ran Paris. They implemented sweeping social reforms. They replaced the standing army with the armed people. They separated church and state.
It was unprecedented.
Completely. And for Marx and Engels, who were watching all this unfold from London, it was breathtaking. It was the first time in history they saw the working class actually hold state power. It was like a proof of concept for everything they'd been writing about.
But the concept was violently crushed.
Brutally crushed. The French state military eventually breached the city, and what followed was known as the Bloody Week. Tens of thousands of communards were massacred in the streets, and thousands more were imprisoned or exiled.
Just a complete wipeout.
Yeah, the movement in France was essentially decapitated.
So the founders of this ideological movement are sitting in London, watching their grand theory materialize in reality, only to be slaughtered because it lacked structure.
That's the key word, structure.
If I'm looking at the mechanics of this, I kind of compare it to a massive improvised jazz band.
Okay, I like that.
You have thousands of passionate musicians who just stormed the concert hall. They have incredible energy, they are deeply angry, and they are ready to play. But there's no conductor. There is no sheet music. They don't even agree on what song they're playing. And when they go up against a highly disciplined, fully funded military orchestra, which is the French state, the jazz band is going to get wiped out every single time.
That captures the specific lesson Marx and Engels took from the ashes of the Commune perfectly. The sheer willpower, the spontaneity, the anger of the working class, it just wasn't enough anymore.
Enthusiasm doesn't stop bullets.
No, it doesn't. The Commune proved that without an independent mass proletarian party, armed with a rigorous scientific theory, the working class would always eventually be outmaneuvered and crushed by the organized state.
They needed to rate the sheet music. They needed a disciplined political party.
Exactly.
But they couldn't build it in France anymore because the French working class had just been physically decimated.
Right. The geopolitical center of gravity had completely shifted because the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871 didn't just cripple France. It resulted in the unification of Germany into this massive, highly industrialized empire.
So the center of the European workers' movement shifts eastward.
Right into the heart of this new German empire.
Now, the sources make a very specific point here about the German workers. Marx and Engels noted that during the war, the German workers had demonstrated a, quote, genuinely international attitude. What does that mean in this context?
Well, it means the German socialists had openly opposed their own government's annexation of French territory. Leaders like August Bebel and Wilhelm Liebknecht, they had actually stood up in the German parliament and voted against war credits.
Wow. During a war?
Yes, and they went to prison for it.
That's a huge risk.
It was a massive risk. But for Marx and Engels, it was a massive signal. It showed that the German workers were beginning to see their primary allegiance not to the German emperor, but to the international working class. They were the perfect candidates to become the new vanguard of the movement.
Which puts Marx and Engels in a fascinating position because they are living in exile in London, but they essentially become this sort of decentralized ideological command center.
That's exactly what they were.
They're receiving this constant, just overwhelming stream of letters from activists across Europe, but primarily from Germany, asking for advice on how to build this mass party.
And the historical period covered in Volume 24 is literally defined by historians as the period of the spread of Marxism.
Right.
It's the transition from these small radical sects into maturing mass socialist parties with distinct proletarian demographics. But to build that mass party, Marx and Engels realized they had to rigorously clarify the most complex problems of political strategy.
They had to define the mechanics.
Exactly. They had to define what a revolution actually looks like mechanically.
Yeah.
They had to elaborate on the concept of the state.
Yeah.
And they really had to figure out which other social classes like the peasantry or the lower middle class could actually be relied upon as allies.
But, I mean, building a mass political party introduces a massive contradiction, doesn't it?
How do you mean?
Well, think about how modern political coalitions are built today. If you want numbers, if you need a mass audience, you have to compromise. You have to soften the edges of your most radical ideas to bring in the moderates.
Right, the big tent approach.
Exactly. So how did Marx and Engels attempt to build a massive inclusive party in Germany without watering down the very theory they believed was essential for survival?
Well, the short answer is they absolutely refused to water it down.
They didn't compromise at all.
Not on theory. And that refusal triggered one of the most explosive internal battles in the history of their movement. The tension you just described, that's the exact catalyst for the showdown over the Gotha program in 1875.
The drama of the Gotha Congress. Let's break down the factions here, because this is where theory hits the really messy reality of organizing.
It's very messy.
So it's 1875. The German socialist movement is fractured into two competing camps. On one side, we have the Eisenachers. These are the folks led by Bebel and Liebknecht. These are Marx and Engels guys, ideologically speaking. And on the other side, we have the General Association of German Workers. These are the followers of a recently deceased, highly charismatic labor leader named Ferdinand Lassalle.
And to understand why this was such a bitter fight, you really have to understand the Lassalleans. Ferdinand Lassalle was a brilliant orator, but his economic theories were completely incompatible with Marx's.
How so?
Well, more importantly than just the economics, LaSalle believed that the working class could achieve its goals by working directly with the Prussian state. He even held secret meetings with the Prussian Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck.
Wait, he was secretly meeting with Bismarck.
Yes, trying to secure state funding for workers' cooperatives.
So the Lassalleans are essentially saying, the state is a neutral tool. If we just ask nicely or ally with the aristocracy against the liberal capitalists, the state will help us.
Which Marx and Engels viewed as catastrophically naive and utterly unscientific.
I can imagine.
But the problem in 1875 was that both factions were suffering under heavy government persecution. And they realized they needed to unite if they were going to survive. So they planned this unity congress in the town of Gotha to merge into a single, massive social democratic workers' party.
And to do this, they draft a joint party program, the Gotha program.
Exactly.
And when the draft of this program reaches Marx and Engels in London, they suffer a collective aneurysm.
They absolutely lose their minds over it.
They look at the text and realize their own allies, Bebel and Liebknecht, have made massive theoretical concessions to the Lassalleans just to secure the merger.
Right.
Which prompts Marx to write the now famous critique of the Gotha program, while Engels fires off this blistering, highly critical letter to Bebel in March of 1875.
And we really have to look at the specific mechanisms Marx is attacking in this critique, because one of the biggest compromises in the draft program was the inclusion of Lassalle's iron law of wages.
Oh, let's unpack that because it sounds incredibly imposing. The iron law of wages. What is the mechanism behind that, and why did Marx despise it so much?
Well, the iron law of wages was essentially a recycled idea from earlier bourgeois economists like Thomas Malthus. LaSalle argued that wages are mathematically trapped at the absolute bare minimum required for a worker to survive and reproduce.
Okay.
The logic goes like this. If wages temporarily go up, workers feel financially secure, so they have more children.
Right, a population boom.
Yeah, and this massively increases the supply of labor in the next generation. That oversupply of labor drives the value of wages right back down to starvation levels. And if wages dip below starvation, workers die off, the labor supply shrinks, and wages rise back to the minimum.
It makes it sound like poverty is just this inescapable biological law of supply and demand.
Precisely. Or rather, that is exactly why Marx tore to shreds. Marx argued that the iron law of wages completely, fundamentally misdiagnoses how capitalism actually works.
It shifts the blame.
Exactly. It blames biology and worker demographics for poverty. But Marx had already spent decades proving that wages are not driven down by workers having too many children. Wages are driven down by the structural mechanics of capitalism itself.
Like, what mechanics specifically?
By the constant replacement of human labor with machinery, and by the intentional maintenance of what he called a reserve army of labor.
Meaning the unemployed.
Yes, the unemployed keep the employed wages low, not birth rates.
So if you concede to LaSalle's iron law in your official party document, you're telling the working class that the capitalist isn't the problem, their own fertility is the problem.
And that destroys the entire theoretical foundation of the movement. This is why Marx and Engels were so incredibly aggressive about this. For them, a party's official program is its theoretical banner. It's the constitution of the movement.
You can't put bad math in the Constitution.
No. Marx wrote that while you can make practical agreements for joint action, tactical alliances, you must never bargain over principles. If you put bad theory into your foundational document, you will inevitably adopt bad tactics, and your movement will fail.
Now, another major sticking point in the critique is the concept of the state itself. The Lassalleans wanted a free state, which honestly seems like a nice, harmless phrase.
It sounds lovely.
It does. But Marx uses this section to introduce a phrase that has caused just endless confusion and debate ever since. The dictatorship of the proletariat.
Yes, a very heavy phrase.
Extremely heavy. How did Marx define this mechanism in the context of 1875? Because to a modern listener, the word dictatorship brings up horrific 20th century autocracies.
Context is absolutely vital here. In the 19th century, the word dictatorship did not primarily mean a totalitarian tyrant like we envision today. It referred back to the Roman Republic concept of a dictatura.
Which was a temporary thing, right?
Exactly. It was a temporary emergency concentration of power to manage a specific crisis. Marx argued that you cannot just politely ask the capitalist state to become a free state that helps workers. The state, in his view, is an instrument of class rule. It exists for one class to suppress another.
So you can't just repurpose it.
Right. To transition from capitalism to a classless society, the working class would have to conquer political power and establish a transitional state.
A temporary mechanism to dismantle the old system.
Yes. The dictatorship of the proletariat essentially meant the democratic rule of the working class majority over the former exploiting minority, just long enough to socialize the means of production.
And then what happens to it?
Once the economic basis of class division was removed, the need for a coercive state would vanish. The state would, in Engels' later words, wither away. But by adopting Lassalle's vague plea for a free state, the Gotha program was ignoring the harsh reality of how power is actually maintained and overthrown.
But let me push back on their reaction here just a little bit. Because Bebel and Liebknecht, they are on the ground in Germany. They are facing arrest. They are trying to corral thousands of workers into a unified front just to protect themselves.
Very true.
And here are Marx and Engels in London acting like the ultimate armchair critics, threatening to publicly denounce the Unity Congress over economic semantics. Wasn't it a bit arrogant to prioritize the purity of their economic theory over the immediate safety and unity of the German workers?
Well, Bebel and Liebknecht certainly felt that way. They actually suppressed the publication of Marx's critique for over a decade because they thought it was too divisive.
Oh, wow. They hid it from the party.
They did. But Marx and Engels weren't just trying to win a local election or build a temporary union. They believed they were mapping the objective laws of human historical development. If your map has a fundamental error, if it says the state is your friend, or that wages are determined by biology, you will eventually lead your entire movement off a cliff.
Which perfectly illustrates the defining conflict of Volume 24. They weren't just fighting bad economics, they were fighting what they saw as bad philosophy.
Yeah, exactly.
They had to firmly draw the line between well-meaning fantasies and what they considered hard science.
And this brings us to one of the most important theoretical contributions of this entire decade. During this period, Engels writes a massive, heavily polemical book called Anti-Dühring.
Okay.
It was a response to a German academic named Eugen Dühring who was trying to introduce his own, frankly, confusing brand of socialism into the party. But from that larger work, Engels extracted 3 chapters to create a pamphlet called Socialism, Utopian and Scientific.
And that became massive, right?
Oh, it became one of the most widely read socialist texts in history.
So let's break down that title, The Battle Between Utopian and Scientific. Engels goes out of his way to define what came before them as utopian. He talks about figures from the early 19th century, people like Henri de Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, and the British industrialist Robert Owen.
Right.
What made these thinkers utopian?
Well, the utopians were brilliant critics of early capitalism. They saw the poverty, the child labor, the sheer misery of the Industrial Revolution, and they were horrified.
Understandably.
But their mechanism for fixing it was purely ideological. They believed that socialism was simply the expression of absolute truth, reason, and universal justice.
So they thought society was just suffering from a lack of good ideas.
Exactly, their logic.
Yeah.
The utopians believed that if you could just design the perfect blueprint for a society and explain it clearly enough to everybody, including the wealthy factory owners, humanity would naturally adopt it because humans are rational.
That seems a bit optimistic.
Highly optimistic. Robert Owen, for example, actually bought a massive textile mill complex in Scotland called New Lanark, and he ran it as a cooperative model community.
Okay, so he put his money where his mouth was.
Yes, he did. He instituted schools for the workers' children, improved housing, and he proved you could be profitable without treating workers like animals.
But New Lanark didn't trigger a global socialist revolution.
No, because it relied entirely on the benevolence of one enlightened factory owner. Engels pointed out that you cannot change the structural rules of an entire global economic system by appealing to the moral conscience of the people who benefit from it.
It's like trying to change the rules of Monopoly while you're actively playing the game.
I love that analogy.
You know, you look at the person who owns Boardwalk and Park Place and they've got hotels on everything.
Right.
And you say to them, listen, this game is making the rest of us miserable. It would be much more reasonable and just if we all just shared the properties.
And what do they say?
They're going to say no. The person winning isn't going to hand over their properties just because it's a nice idea. The board itself is designed to consolidate wealth and bankrupt the rest of the players. The utopians were trying to win with moral arguments against a game built on mathematical exploitation.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it. Marx and Engels argued that scientific socialism must completely abandon those appeals to universal morality. Instead, it must base its conclusions on a profound theoretical analysis of the objective material reality.
You have to study the Monopoly board
Yeah,
itself.
exactly. Engels wrote, "Socialism, since it has become a science, demands that it be pursued as a science. That is, that it be studied."
And Engels credits Marx with two specific world-altering discoveries that finally transformed socialism from a utopian dream into a hard science. We really need to unpack the mechanics of both of these discoveries because they are the engines driving every letter and essay in Volume 24.
They absolutely are.
The first one is the materialist conception of history, often called historical materialism. What is the actual mechanism here?
Okay, so historical materialism flips traditional philosophy on its head. Up until then, historians largely believed that history was driven by ideas. The Enlightenment, the ideals of liberty, the genius of great men, these intellectual shifts were seen as the root cause of social change. Marx argued the exact opposite. He argued that the ultimate cause of all important historical events is not found in the changing ideas of human beings, but in changes in the mode of production and exchange.
The economics determine the ideas, not the other way around.
Yes. Society is built on a foundation, the economic base. How do we produce food? How do we manufacture goods? Who owns the tools?
Okay, the material reality.
Exactly. That economic base generates a superstructure. The politics, the legal system, the religion, the art, and the morality of that society. The superstructure always evolves to justify and protect the economic base.
So the laws exist to protect the way we make things.
Right. If the base changes, say, moving from feudal agriculture to industrial capitalism, the politics and the religion will eventually mutate to fit the new economic reality.
As Marx famously put it is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness.
That's the core of it.
Think about how this applies today. We have a culture obsessed with individual hustle, personal branding, gig work, flexibility. Oh, absolutely.
A utopian would say, our ideas about freedom have changed. But historical materialism says, our ideas have changed because our mode of production shifted to algorithmic, app-based, decentralized capital, and our culture evolved to justify that specific economic structure.
You're tracking it perfectly. You cannot think your way out of a system. You have to change the material base of how things are produced.
Which leads directly to Marx's second great discovery, the theory of surplus value.
Right.
Because if historical materialism explains how societies change, surplus value explains the hidden mathematical essence of capitalist exploitation. It explains where profit actually comes from.
The holy grail of economics.
Let's break this down to the absolute brass tacks. How does surplus value work mechanically? Because, most people just assume profit is just buying something for $1 and selling it for $2.
Right. Buying low and selling high. And that explains merchant profit, sure, but it doesn't explain how new value is created in the entire economy.
Marx asked, when a capitalist buys machinery, raw materials, and human labor and turns them into a product, where does the extra value come from? It cannot come from the machines or the cotton. They just transfer their existing value into the product. The new value comes entirely from human labor.
But the worker is being paid a wage for their labor, so where is the exploitation? If we both agree on $20 an hour, isn't that a fair trade?
And that is the genius of Marx's distinction. The capitalist doesn't immediately buy the worker's labor. The capitalist buys the worker's labor power.
Labor power.
Yes. Their capacity to work for a specific amount of time, say a 10-hour shift. The value of that labor power is determined by what it costs to keep the worker alive and functioning: food, rent, clothing.
Okay, so let's say it costs $20 a day for a worker to survive and pay rent. The capitalist pays the worker a wage of $20 for a 10-hour shift.
Exactly. But here is the mechanism of surplus value. The worker might generate that $20 worth of value in the first 4 hours of their shift. That is the necessary labor.
Okay, they've earned their keep in 4 hours.
Right. But the worker doesn't get to go home after 4 hours. The capitalist bought their labor power for the full 10 hours. So for the remaining 6 hours, the worker is creating new value, entirely unpaid, which goes directly into the capitalist's pocket.
Wow.
That is surplus labor, generating surplus value.
So profit isn't a premium added at the cash register. Profit is mathematically quantified, unpaid labor time extracted on the factory floor.
It is the extraction of unpaid labor, disguised by the wage contract. By proving this mathematically, Marx argued that exploitation isn't a moral failing of a greedy factory owner. Even the nicest factory owner on earth, a modern Robert Owen,
Yeah.
they have to extract surplus value, or they will be bankrupted by competitors.
Because the game demands it.
Exactly. It is a structural mathematical requirement of the capitalist system.
And this is why Engels was so confident in calling their theories a science. But I have to bring up a detail from the sources that just blew my mind. When Engels was publishing Anti-Düring, he wasn't just arguing with economists. He was actively trying to align their economic theories with the hard natural sciences. He actually sent copies of this highly dense political economy book to prominent zoologists.
You did.
Why on earth is he mailing socialist theory to biologists?
Because Engels was deeply fascinated by the natural sciences, specifically Charles Darwin's theory of evolution.
Okay.
For Marx and Engels, Darwin had accomplished in biology what they were attempting to accomplish in human history. Darwin discovered the objective laws of development of organic nature. He showed how species evolved through natural selection, completely devoid of any divine plan or moral teleology.
Right.
Engels wanted to show these zoologists that historical materialism was doing the exact same thing for human society, mapping the objective laws of social evolution.
But you cannot claim to have discovered a universal scientific law if it only works in a laboratory, or in this case, if it only explains Western Europe.
Absolutely not. It has to be universal.
If historical materialism is truly a science, it has to accurately analyze completely alien economic landscapes. Which brings us to a massive shift in their focus during this decade. They turn their eyes away from the familiar battlegrounds of France and Germany, and they start peering over the horizon at two emerging global superpowers.
America and Russia.
America and Russia. And their geopolitical foresight here, reading the raw data from these countries, is incredibly prescient.
It's almost eerie how accurate they were. Throughout the late 1870s, capitalism was becoming a truly global system. Marx and Engels realized that the traditional European powers were no longer going to be the sole arbiters of the future.
Let's start with the United States. Following the American Civil War, the U.S. is undergoing an industrial explosion. What specific data points are Marx and Engels tracking in America?
They are heavily tracking the massive growth of the American railways, the expansion of agriculture in the Midwest, and most importantly, the unprecedented concentration of capital.
The monopolies.
Yes, they are watching the transition from competitive, small-scale capitalism into monopoly capitalism.
They are watching the birth of the massive continent-spanning corporations.
Exactly. Engels writes articles analyzing how these massive American companies are beginning to completely control entire industries and huge swaths of land.
Right.
They are diagnosing in real time that Great Britain, which had been the undisputed workshop of the world, is beginning to lose its industrial monopoly to the United States. They see the sheer scale of American resources and industrialization, and they predict that the U.S. is inevitably going to become the dominant force of the capitalist world market.
Think about the massive tech monopolies or global shipping conglomerates we deal with today. When Engels was watching the American railways consolidate, he was looking at the exact genetic ancestors of the modern corporate monopoly.
He saw the whole trajectory.
He recognized the mechanism of capital naturally aggregating into fewer and fewer hands. But while they saw America as the ultimate future of capitalism, their analysis of Russia was entirely different and arguably much more urgent.
Russia was the great unknown. Historically, the Russian Empire had been the bulwark of European reaction. The Tsar had this massive standing army, and whenever there was a democratic revolution in Europe, the Tsar would send troops to crush it.
The ultimate final boss for any revolution.
Right. But in the 1870s, Marx and Engels realized that the Russian behemoth was rotting from the inside out.
And this requires us to look at the massive societal shift that happened in Russia in 1861, which was the abolition of serfdom.
Yes.
Now, on paper, emancipating the serfs sounds like a great modernizing leap forward. But Marx and Engels deeply studied the socioeconomic reality of this reform.
And this is exactly why Marx was learning Russian. He needed to read the raw agrarian data regarding the Obshchina, the traditional Russian peasant commune.
The local village structures.
Right. What Marx and Engels discovered was that the 1861 emancipation was essentially a massive economic fraud perpetrated on the peasantry.
How so? What was the mechanism of the fraud?
Well, when the serfs were freed, they were not simply given the land they had worked for generations. They were forced to buy it back from the nobility through what were called redemption payments.
Oh, wow.
But the land was massively overvalued by the state, and the nobility kept the most fertile plots, the vital forests, and the water access for themselves.
So they get the worst land at the highest price.
Exactly. So the peasants were legally free. But economically, they were strapped with unpayable, multi-generational debt and left with land that could barely sustain them.
Which creates a boiling pressure cooker of mass discontent.
It's a huge pressure cooker.
You have an impoverished, starving peasant majority, and simultaneously you have growing frustration among the enlightened, educated nobility and the intelligentsia who see the autocratic system completely failing to modernize the country.
And Marx was absolutely obsessed with tracking this pressure cooker. There is a deeply human detail in the correspondence from this time. Marx writes a bitterly complaining letter to a Russian associate, Pyotr Lavrov, because a parcel of books sent from Russia got lost in the mail.
I love that.
Marx calls these lost books absolutely essential for his work on the second volume of Capital, specifically his chapters on landed property.
It's just so relatable. The grand sweeping theory of world history is temporarily derailed by the inefficiency of the 19th century postal service.
It really grounds these massive ideas in everyday frustration.
But what was their ultimate synthesis of all this Russian data? Where did they see it leading?
They concluded that Russia stood on the threshold of a world historical crisis. The financial ruin of the peasantry, combined with the immense economic stress of the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, was creating a uniquely revolutionary situation.
But Engels makes a fascinating specific prediction here.
He does.
He argues that the collapse of the Russian Empire will not be a sudden, overnight event like the storming of the Bastille.
Right, he foresaw a slow bleed. He wrote that the disintegration of the Tsarist autocracy would be a long, protracted process that would go on for years. It would be an agonizing structural failure.
And for the European workers' movement, the fall of Russian Tsarism would be the ultimate game changer because it would remove the great military reserve of European reaction.
Once the Tsar is gone, no one is coming to save the European monarchs.
Exactly. But here is the incredible tension of Volume 24. While they are peering over the horizon, predicting the rise of American monopolies and the collapse of the Russian Empire, they are simultaneously fighting vicious, immediate political battles right on their own doorstep in Germany.
They never caught a break.
Never. They have to deal with the most cunning political operator of the 19th century, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck.
Bismarck is the Iron Chancellor, the architect of the German Empire, and he presents a massive, deeply confusing threat to the socialist movement because he is attacking them with both a legislative club and a very deceptive ideological carrot.
Let's talk about the carrot first, because this required Marx and Engels to go on the offensive to clarify their theory once again. Bismarck begins introducing major state interventions into the German economy. He implements the nationalization of the state railways, he passes aggressive, protective customs tariffs, and because he is using the state to control industry, some members of the German socialist movement get deeply confused.
They look at the state taking over the trains and say, wait, is Bismarck implementing socialist policies? State control of industry is socialism, right?
Which is a misconception that still thrives today. People assume that any time the government does something, it's socialism. How did Engels dismantle this idea of Bismarck's state socialism?
Well, Engels writes pieces with brilliant, biting titles like Prussian Schnapps and the German Reichstag, and The Socialism of Mr. Bismarck. He breaks down the mechanism of state ownership.
Okay.
Engels argues vehemently that Bismarck nationalizing the railways was absolutely not a step towards socialism. It was the reactionary consolidation of economic power by the Prussian state to serve the ruling aristocratic class, the Junkers, and to make the military apparatus more efficient.
He points out that the state itself is not a neutral entity. The state is just the ideal personification of the total national capital.
Right.
If the state is controlled by a militaristic, aristocratic elite, then giving that state more economic power just gives the elite a tighter grip on the working class.
Exactly the dynamic. Engels explains that under state capitalism, the workers are still exploited wage laborers. The mechanism of surplus value is exactly the same.
They're still doing the unpaid hours.
Yes. The only difference is that their boss is now the heavily armed government rather than a private capitalist. State ownership does not automatically equal proletarian emancipation. It often just centralizes the oppression.
I'm trying to picture the lived experience of a German worker at this time trying to navigate this. It's like having an incredibly strict, abusive parent who suddenly seizes total control of your bank account, dictates what you can buy, and then tells you, look, I relieved you of the burden of financial planning. You have financial freedom.
It is a total weaponization of the concept of freedom.
And while Bismarck is trying to confuse the workers with this fake state socialism, he brings down the club. In 1878, he introduces the infamous anti-socialist law,
Which was a brutal crackdown. He essentially bans all socialist organizations. He shuts down their trade unions, closes their newspapers, and arrests or exiles their leaders. The German Social Democratic Party is forced entirely underground.
But paradoxically, Marx and Engels argue that this brutal oppression actually hardens the party.
It does. It forces the movement to become tighter and more resilient.
It burns off the dead wood.
Exactly. The weak, reformist elements who are willing to compromise with the state are largely purged or sidelined by the pressure. The workers have to learn how to organize illegal literature distribution, how to maintain international communications, and how to survive under the boot of the state while simultaneously rejecting Bismarck's state-sponsored fake reforms.
It forged a much more theoretically clear and disciplined party.
It really did.
And fighting these ideological wars on multiple fronts, battling the utopians who think you can polite your way into a new society, battling the Lassalleans who want to compromise the science of the movement, and battling Bismarck, who is actively trying to destroy them while stealing their vocabulary, it took an unimaginable amount of energy.
An exhausting amount of energy.
Which brings us to the most poignant and often overlooked aspect of this deep dive. Behind the curtain of these grand historical writings, behind the letters mapping out global geopolitics, there was a deeply tragic personal reality unfolding in London.
Yeah, we often read these forceful, endlessly confident theoretical texts, and we completely forget that they were written by flesh and blood human beings who were suffering immensely. The letters from 1874 to 1883 strip away the marble statues and reveal the profound human cost of their work.
The sources make this incredibly clear. During this entire decade, both Marx and his wife Jenny were frequently and seriously ill. Marx is plagued by ailments, insomnia, boils, liver issues, respiratory problems that literally keep him from working for weeks or months at a time.
And you can feel it in the letters. The frustration is palpable. He knows he has a monumental task in finishing Capital, and his body is actively betraying him.
And then there is the unimaginable psychological heartbreak. During this period, Marx's eldest daughter, also named Jenny, suffers the profound trauma of losing her firstborn child.
It's awful.
The grief radiating through the family correspondence is devastating.
And Engels was not spared from this pain either. Not at all. Engels' wife, Lizzie Burns, who is deeply connected to the Irish working class movement and was an absolutely vital, vibrant part of Engels' life, suffered from repeated, severe illnesses. She ultimately passed away in 1878. Engels was heartbroken.
And yet, what strikes me when I read through this correspondence is the sheer resilience of their solidarity. Despite their own financial precariousness, despite their failing health, and despite being buried under profound emotional grief, their letters show them constantly, almost obsessively, helping their friends and political associates.
They were the anchor for hundreds of exiles and activists.
They really were.
They are constantly sending money they can barely spare. They're offering moral support, legal advice, and strategic guidance to activists who have been imprisoned, beaten, or are facing severe persecution across Europe. There is a specific letter from Engels to a struggling associate that perfectly encapsulates his character. He simply writes, "Anything I can do for you will always be done without fail, and always with pleasure."
It radically humanizes these towering historical figures. It proves that the voluminous, world-changing output of Volume 24, the rigorous destruction of utopianism, the complex economic mechanisms mapped out for capital, the geopolitical foresight, was all achieved amidst a backdrop of profound grief and physical decline.
They weren't writing from a comfortable ivory tower. They were writing from a very real, very painful human experience.
And this entire era, this decade of relentless theoretical and personal struggle, concludes with the ultimate loss. On March 14, 1883, Karl Marx dies.
It is the end of one of the most consequential intellectual partnerships in human history. Engels delivers his famous graveside speech at Highgate Cemetery, summarizing his friend's massive contributions to human thought.
But after the funeral, when the dust settles and Engels goes back to his study, he is struck by a terrifying realization. The massive burden of the entire international movement has now fallen completely on his shoulders.
He writes a letter to August Bebel just weeks after Marx's death in 1883, and the weight of the moment is incredibly heavy. Engels says he has to maintain intact, insofar as it is in his power, the many threads from all over the world which spontaneously converged upon Marx's study.
That is a staggering responsibility for a man who is already in his 60s and mourning his closest friend.
Huge.
He suddenly becomes the sole literary executor of an unfinished masterpiece. He has to take on the Herculean task of deciphering Marx's notoriously terrible handwriting, organizing piles of chaotic, brilliant notes, and attempting to put together the unfinished second and third volumes of Capital.
And simultaneously, he has to act as the primary advisor to a rapidly growing, increasingly complex international political machine.
Historians still debate the impact of this transition, right?
They do. Without Marx's expansive, constantly inquiring mind, the mind that would stop everything to learn Russian, just to chase down a new variable in agrarian data, Engels had to become the definitive systematizer of the theory.
He had to make it readable.
Exactly. He had to package the sprawling genius of Marx into accessible, clear, and sometimes more rigid formats for the rapidly growing workers' movement. Some argue this led to a slightly more codified, dogmatic version of the theory later on, because Engels was constantly defending the orthodoxy against a rising tide of reformism without Marx there to bounce ideas off of.
That makes sense.
But one thing is undeniable. Engels' absolute dedication in those final years is the only reason the complete theory of capital exists today. He sacrificed almost all of his own original work, his own independent research, to ensure that Marx's legacy survived and was disseminated to the world.
It is the ultimate act of friendship, wrapped in an unwavering political commitment. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's pull the threads together and look at the tapestry of this decade. We started in the ashes of the 1871 Paris Commune, witnessing how a violent defeat forced a massive tactical pivot, shifting the ideological center of the workers' movement from the barricades of France to the disciplined mass party organizing of Germany.
Right, and we saw how that mass organizing led to bitter theoretical warfare over the Gotha program.
Right.
We broke down the mechanics of Lassalle's iron law of wages and why Marx fundamentally rejected it in favor of his own structural critique of capitalism. We unpacked how Engels intellectually defined scientific socialism against the moral dreaming of the utopians, using the mechanisms of historical materialism and surplus value to map the objective laws of society, much like Darwin mapped biology.
We looked at their staggering geopolitical foresight, watching them stare at raw data to predict the rise of American corporate monopolies and the slow, agonizing disintegration of the Russian Empire. We watched them battle Chancellor Bismarck on two fronts, exposing the deceptive mechanics of his state-sponsored capitalism while surviving the brutal crackdowns of his anti-socialist laws.
And finally, we looked at the poignant, heartbreaking human reality behind the theory. The chronic illness, the loss of children and spouses, and the immense burden that left Engels entirely alone in 1883 to synthesize a movement that was about to violently reshape the 20th century.
It is a phenomenal amount of history contained in a single volume of text. And as you go about your day, I want you to consider the sheer fragility of history. Think about how the entire trajectory of global geopolitics, the Russian Revolution, the Cold War, the rise of mass political parties, the global clash over economic structures, was so heavily influenced by the theoretical framework built by two men sitting in drafty rooms in London.
It's wild to think about.
Two men who were battling chronic illness, mourning the tragic losses of their families, and furiously writing angry letters when a package of books got lost in the mail. It really makes you wonder, how many world-changing ideologies, how many profound blueprints for the future are currently being drafted right now in the quiet, messy, and complicated lives of obscure thinkers today? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the structures around you, keep looking for the hidden mechanics in the primary sources, and keep unpacking the history that shapes our world.